Welcome to the Liberty Alert with Gregory Seltz, sponsored by our friends at the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberties here in Washington, D.C., a program that cuts through the chaos and confusion in the culture today by talking two-kingdom citizenship, old biblical principles for a robust, public Christian life. And now your host, Dr. Gregory Seltz.
Good day, Washington, D.C., and all of our supporters all across the country. I'm Dr. Gregory Seltz, and this is the Liberty Alert on WFAX here in Washington. And every week we try to come at you and talk about the issues that are pertinent to people of faith. And the main issue that we're always talking about is religious liberty. We're trying again to keep the church's voice a public voice in the culture. And for those of you who don't think that there's any assault on the church's public voice, then you're just not listening. Because in many places, they're trying to make the teachings, the moral teachings of the church, not just unwanted in the public square, but illegal in the public square. It's crazy, because those moral teachings are actually the teachings that put government in its place, challenge us to live virtuous lives, and undergird the freedoms that all of us cherish, whether we're Christian or not. I don't know what's going on in your life today, but we are in the midst of a crazy storm here in Washington, D.C. I guess we had a mild December, and it's giving way to a ferocious January. I pray that your families are safe today. It's been a crazy week, and I think things are finally getting back to normal. But in January, even in the midst of the crazy weather, it is a pro-life month. Every year there is a march, and it's coming up March 21st on a Friday, and we're going to participate again. The LCRL is a big supporter of the March for Life here in Washington, as well as the pro-life groups that are around the country. It's the largest human rights protest in the world. In fact, it's actually a movement. But unfortunately, it's a movement that is demonized or caricatured by the cultural forces that run things. And again, when people say, well, who do you mean? Well, folks, just look at the data. In the universities, in the humanities departments, it's ideologically monolithic. Virtually, I read an article of the top 60 universities in the country. When it comes to things like the humanities department, they are overwhelmingly ideologically leftists. And right now, the leftism is at home in the Democratic Party, and so that means they're not going to give any voice to the pro-life movement whatsoever in your children's and your kids' educational experience. That should shock you. You don't send kids to be propagandized. You send them to be educated. And it's like that in the universities. It's like that in entertainment. It's like that in our newspaper, the legacy media. They are overwhelmingly ideologically monolithic. And 1973 literally made our voice illegal in the country, even though pro-life is the most positive voice for all people. And we're at a point where 50 years later, we're taking the narrative back. And that's what we want to talk about today. Our guest is going to be Jeanne Mancini. She'll be coming up here in just a minute, but she's the head of the March for Life. But she's part of a movement where we're taking the narrative back. And we're saying pro-life is pro-woman, it's pro-family, it's pro-child. And so there are two articles that I just saw where it's talked about. One of them was an NFL player. What was his name here? His name was Jacob Hollister on the Jacksonville Jaguars. He actually supports a pro-life charity. And he talks about loving them both. Loving the woman, loving the mother, and loving the child, and how that's something the society has to rise up to, and supporting that. Well, that wouldn't be possible 20 years ago. They would have said that's too political. Take those, get rid of that charity. But in a time where people are wearing patches for other organizations that people have real issues with, it's incredible that finally something pro-life is supported rather than demonized, caricatured, and put out to pasture. And then there was a media outlet that asked for abortion stories, and they got tons of pro-life responses. Because people truly understand, their gut reaction is that life is to be cherished. And no society should actually make it easy to dispose of the most vulnerable among us. So again, how do we take that narrative back? How do we take that positive narrative back? And I think that's what the March for Life is all about. So today, we are privileged to have on our program the president for the March for Life, Jeanne Mancini, and she's been at the helm now. Is it 10 years that you've been at the helm of the March for Life, or is it longer?
Just about 10 years. This will be my 10th March for Life, and it seems like it's flown in a lot of ways, but in terms of actual time that I've been working here, about 9.5 years.
Well, welcome to the program, Jeanne.
Thanks so much for having me, Greg. Really, really just delighted to be here with you.
Well, we've been a big supporter of the March for Life, but it goes back long before I was the executive director of the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty, and the LCMS has been part of the Life movement for a long time, but it even goes back to the 80s, and we worked with the Catholic Church in New York City. And this has been a movement that started right after Roe, because the narrative was somehow that progress was pro-choice and pro-life was yesterday's news. But I got to tell you, you are the head of an organization that I think is one of the most positive organizations in the country. And one of the things that I love about the pro-life movement, in spite of being overspent by gazillions of dollars, you guys have taken back the narrative in many, many ways. Can you talk to that? I know that's got to be a stated goal of the movement, because the narrative pro-life is a beautiful, beautiful thing, even for people who disagree with us. So how have you been doing that?
Well, in a way, it's such, first of all, thank you for that beautiful compliment. And really what we try to do at the March is just show life for what it is and show what's happening in culture for what it is. So it's not even, I wish I could say that it was as strategic as proactively taking back the narrative. But the truth is that we're just showing things as they are. And that narrative is real, true, and good, and is for life. So the reality is that in many ways, life is winning, I guess you could say. Maybe that's the way that we're sort of taking back the narrative and we're pointing that out. And what do I mean by that? Well, what you're seeing is that we've got, pretty much the lowest abortion rate. It did uptick a tiny bit in the last report, but the lowest abortion rate ever since Roe v. Wade. We've got 8 out of 10 Americans wanting to limit abortion much more than it's been limited in this country, or even is allowed to be limited under Roe in this country. And that's for 10 years strong. If you're looking at public opinion, you've got young people that are predominantly on the side of life. And so all of these different things, and perhaps the most beautiful, I think, point is that pregnancy care centers are flourishing, and that women and men facing unexpected pregnancies are receiving the services that they need after the baby is born, and the support they need to choose life. And so in many ways, life is winning, and this is just real, true, and good, what we're talking about. Now, the reality is that we're still looking at well over 800,000 abortions every single year in this country. So to say, life is winning, I sort of shudder a little bit at the same time, because the task is daunting, and we have so much ahead of us still in building a culture of life. But are we moving in the right direction legally? And are we moving in the right direction in terms of every day saving more lives? 110% by God's grace. Yes.
Yeah. And again, people need to understand that we're doing this from the ground up, because the pro-abortion movement, it's Hollywood's on its side. You've got millions and millions of dollars, even government money coming into those edifices. But this stuff's coming from the sacrifice of people from below. And in spite of the fact that we're overspent and we're overwhelmed sometimes by the fact that the narrative is out there kind of castigating us. Like you said, life is winning. And that's what I love about what you guys do with March for Life. You have a theme every year. And I loved when I first was able to march with you. In fact, I think that was the year that I got a chance to speak at the Rose Dinner right after Vice President Pence. What an incredible time that was. But it was pro-life is pro-science, pro-life is pro-woman, pro-life is pro-family. And you were getting that narrative out. Well, what's the narrative? What's the theme this year?
Oh, thank you for asking. It's so fun to choose a theme, because the March for Life brings together really the whole pro-life movement. And so in the way of education, I would say it allows a springboard for formation and just information on what can be the most pressing issues of our time. So this year, we chose Equality Begins in the Womb. Equality Begins in the Womb. And Craig, I have to tell you, in God's providential designs, we chose that well before the Supreme Court announced that they would be taking up Dobbs.
Okay.
So we chose it much more because we're hearing so much over the past year about equity and equality, and we wanted to insert into that very important conversation the reality of the unborn child, and who we would describe as the most vulnerable, the poorest of the poor, that they too deserve that quote unquote equality. They are equal in dignity and deserve the very most basic right, the right to life.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Dobbs, because people don't really dig into the details. And by the way, for those of you who think that this is a partisan issue, there are 20 million pro-life Democrats. They just don't happen to be on their platform, And so again, we're talking to anyone and everyone who values life and the dignity of life, because it's a very powerful movement. But the Dobbs case, when we were just talking to the folks that argued that before the Supreme Court, and people don't understand that for the first time in human history, in at least in American history, the government's role, which is to protect, like you said, the vulnerable, that's their main job, to make sure that everyone has equal justice, not just the most powerful people. Everyone has equal justice before the law. For the first time, the government had this argument that if the baby was not viable, you could kill it. And so you're thinking, wait a minute, they're the least viable or they're the most vulnerable. Shouldn't you be protecting them the most? And the abortion debate flipped the government's role upside down. And Dobbs is taking that on. That viability argument is such a treacherous one, because if a government can dispense with you because you're not viable, oh my gosh, where can that go, right?
Amen.
So I think this is the year. So again, whatever happens with Dobbs, what do you think about the fact that for the first time in our lifetime, we're going to flip back to a culture that defends life first and foremost? How do you think that's going to play going forward?
Well, first of all, I just want to reiterate what you just said there, Greg, and to emphasize, wow, the fact that we're even having this conversation before the Supreme Court is remarkable. And please God, I'm very hopeful that this may go in our direction in June, which is important to state. What does that mean? Well, the question of abortion legislation would return to the states. So in other words, the different legislative branches in the states could then make decisions. So, you'd see California would sadly have wide open laws allowing for and paying for abortion, where you'd see a state like Texas, of course, would have very protective laws. So in terms of the question of viability, it's really what everything hinges on right now. So the Dobbs decision is an interesting one in that the law itself would limit or basically outlaw abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy in Mississippi. And because, of course, that's pre-viability, it would really gut the heart of Roe combined with Casey. Those two decisions, basically, those two Supreme Court decisions, Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, which happened in the early 90s. In the early 90s, that they basically don't allow states to make any kind of laws that would limit abortion prior to viability. So if Dobbs wins, it guts that reality so that states will have much more control over pro-life laws, so that states like Texas will be allowed to have laws that protect life after the heartbeat can be detected, and states like Mississippi can protect life after 15 weeks. So we're very hopeful that this will go in that direction. Yeah,
and people need to understand too, just so you have points of comparison, the whole Western world, people think of Europe as being much more liberal than America. They don't have abortion after the 15th week, and then when you think of New York's laws where you can literally abort a baby even after it's born after the 9th month. I mean, folks, that's outrageous. It's egregious. We as a human race can't sustain ourselves if we are we have that much animus to the most vulnerable among us. So this could be a watershed moment in our culture. And I guess I said what I love about the March for Life is that they've been building this positive narrative that says, look, even if you disagree with us, we care about you. Your life is valuable. The pro-life movement is an all-encompassing movement. It's one that really, it's truly the big tent movement of our culture, if you think about it that way, right?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. It's yeah, that's very well said. And something that is important to us, and maybe it could be important for some of your listeners, is that we know that women deserve so much better than abortion. You know, you had talked about false narratives at the beginning, and I think the worst narrative is that abortion is empowering for women. That's right. The false narrative, and it's evil, in my humble opinion. And so we want to help women who've been involved in abortion find hope and healing. Because, you know, it's like the enemy of God does not want women to have that experience of freedom and healing and hope. And part of that big tent is, in fact, a big part of that big tent is bringing people who've really been hurt by abortion into the fold and helping them to tell their story so that other people don't have to share those kind of war wounds and can find that hope and healing.
You know, you well said, because early on, and like I said, we've been a part of this movement. Yvette was a counselor, pro-life counselor in New York City when we worked with Cardinal O'Connor and the Catholic Church in New York and things like that. And we used to always say, this is the most anti-feminist, if you want to use that terminology, or chauvinistic movement, because what it does to finally the dad is say, well, if you just throw $200 at it, you're done. You know, that's the extent of your involvement with the life of that child. And I kept saying, how is that good for the mother? How is that good for the child? And then we, of course, with Cardinal O'Connor, we took away that whole thing about, well, you don't care about the woman. Well, if the woman would bring it to term, we took care of folks, you know, without them having to pay for a dime. And so when you start to think about that, again, the pro-life movement has been this positive movement. But again, the narrative is that we're the ones that are the negative force, and we're taking that back. So first of all, again, I think it's exciting. Now, just for those of you who are coming to the march, we'll be there at the Rose Dinner, because that's, by the way, the Rose Dinner to me, since I didn't get it, you know, now that I'm in Washington, I come to that more often. But man, to listen to some of the speakers that you've had, the physician that was a pro-abortion physician who literally then became a pro-life advocate, to hear her story, I mean, it moves you to tears. Who's speaking this year, and how did the Rose Dinner come about? Was that always part of the march?
It wasn't always part of the march, but it did come about, about 10 years afterwards, 10 to 12 years afterwards. So Nellie Grace, the founder of the March for Life, believe it or not, Gregory, this is going to be our 49th annual March for Life this year. Wow. And I think we're at like the 38th or 39th Rose Dinner. So we've had many, not quite as many marches, but or quite as many as marches. But anyways, as to the speaker this year, oh, I'm so excited. So we have Father Michael Schmitz as our keynote. Now, that will hopefully ring a bell with some of your listeners. But if it doesn't, let me tell you that he had the most popular podcast in the world, much to his shock, leading into the beginning of this year for the first 2 months. And guess what the podcast is? It's the Bible in a year.
That I talked, yeah, exactly. He was just reading through the Bible.
He was just reading through the Bible, and he's still in like the top 20 in the world. He was sort of shocked and awed by the whole thing. I mean, he didn't even know what it meant to, you know, trend in terms of these podcasts. But yes, so at the beginning of this year, for the first few months, it was the #1 podcast in the entire world. And so we've got Father Michael Schmitz joining us, and he'll be our keynote. We've got a few other just wonderful people helping with the Rose Dinner. Perhaps you're familiar with Benjamin Watson of NFL fame. Benjamin will be our MC for the Rose Dinner. And it's just, I think, going to be a really beautiful and special evening.
Now, that brings a lot of the leaders together too. But again, like you said, the March for Life is people from all over the country. And I know that there's marches going on all around the country too, not just in Washington. Talk a little bit about the actual experience of being there, because, and I'll share my impressions too, but you've been at this longer than I have. I mean, it's an incredible group of people that gathers every year.
It is. The best thing that I can say is that it's life-changing to participate in it. And that's different for everyone. I mean, it's truly different whether you're a speaker, a marcher, or what have you. There's something about so much I think the biggest thing that impacts people is the sheer volume of participants. I mean, literally hundreds of thousands of people. DC is shut down for hours. I mean, elbow to elbow, shoulder to shoulder, people are crossing in front of the Supreme Court at the end, showing them that Roe is not settled law. So just the sheer volume of people, but then the kind of people there, we're talking primarily young people, primarily millennials, and they're so positive. They're holding up these, really creative, positive signs about why they're pro-life. It's incredible. And then the speakers are so inspiring. And I think God uses the march to inspire people. So I'll share one quick story. A woman who is considering right now, please listeners, please pray for her, considering a late term abortion because of a fetal anomaly. She was shown a testimony of one of our congressional members, Congresswoman Herrera Butler from Washington State, who shared the story of her daughter's fetal anomaly and being pushed to abort, but she didn't in the end. And you wouldn't even believe her daughter was born with no disability at all. Her daughter was there with her at the March for Life. And so anyways, there's testimony after testimony of God using different stories that happen either through speakers or just people that are met along the walkway. And really, it's just a life-changing experience. Please come. If you've never been, I can't encourage you more to come in person to the March for Life. And I think this year, given Dobbs and everything, could be a truly, truly historic January March for Life.
Well, and again, I not only concur with that, because being there's nothing like it. And amazingly, the weather does not dissuade us. I wish that ruling happened in a little bit warmer time. There have been some cold days, but at the same time, it doesn't inhibit the positive kind of expression, because I've never seen such an civil, joy-filled, singing movement than the March for Life. And again, a lot of that credit has to go to you, your staff, the leaders, because your themes always seem to enhance that spirit. And that's what I love about being a part of that.
Well, thank you so much for saying that. We truly have a beautiful staff, and it's, like you, we're just instruments of what God's asking us to do. And so to God be the glory for all of that. And thank you very much.
Well, one of the things I just want to, last thought on this is, you just mentioned that story of that woman and the child, and Francis Schaeffer. This is what got me way back in college. This is one of the reasons why I turned towards this kind of ministry out of the things I was going to do. I didn't even plan on going into the ministry when I was at University of Michigan. And I remember Francis Schaeffer talking about whatever happened to the human race. And he said, once you develop the concept of the life not worth living, you can dispense with human life just like you would any other, like an ant, or like anything else, like garbage. And really what you're trying to bring back to people is not just the sanctity of their life, but how precious their life really is. And sometimes that can be in spite of circumstances. Sometimes that can be, there can be challenges up front that you're like, we can't deal with this. And then you realize that actually showed me the breadth and the joy of life in a way that I never would have imagined if I didn't have to face that. And he talked about that there is no such thing as a life not worth living, at least inherently. And I thought, man, that's what we're defending. That's what we're.
I couldn't agree more.
What a beautiful thing.
Very
right?
Powerful.
Yeah.
Very, very powerful. I couldn't agree more. So beautifully said. It's like, it's kind of the, I just totally agree that it's like, if that goes, everything goes.
Right. And that's why it's so fundamental, right? People ask me, what are we doing in Washington, D.C.? We're not really there to get political. We're there for two reasons: the sanctity of life and religious liberty, and marriage, and even educational freedom to us are religious liberty questions. And so we try to say, listen, we're trying to defend this even for those with whom we disagree. And that, I think, shocks our opponents sometimes, because they would love to squash our view. We're saying, no, we're not trying to squash your view. We're just trying to say our view matters in the public square as well. And we like
I love that.
Persuade, right? So
I'm so grateful that you're in DC, by the way. I mean, it's so important to be able to, make our culture as God wants it to be, and at least fight for that, because otherwise we're throwing in the towel. And so thank you.
Right. Well, we don't want to throw in the towel. I know our time has come to an end, but I know you're very, very busy. This is probably the craziest time of year for you. We're in the middle of the holidays and things of that nature. And then we're coming up on one of probably a precipice moment in our culture. But again, we are going to be there participating with you. We pray for your leadership. We pray for this experience. And again, what a blessing it is to see you. And I really mean this, not only taking back the narrative, but turning the narrative back towards life just by how you march every year. And what an enhancing thing that is. So thanks for being with us today, Jeanne.
Thank you so much, Reverend Seltz. I should be calling you Reverend, and I've been informal the whole time that we're speaking. But thank you for having me. I'm so honored to be on this, and just really, really grateful to partner with you. Thank you so much.
Last thing, is there anything, are there any challenges, concerns that we need to be praying for you? I know there's a lot of things that need to be done, but any headwinds, any challenges, or any things we can do for you as we spread the message?
Can't tell you how much I appreciate that question. Every single year in January, I can sense spiritual warfare in a way that always seems new and, and stronger. Of course, we know that the devil is not God's equal. He's also a creature, so it's like just spiritual warfare. You have to kind of blow it off at the same time. Boy, it can be oppressive. So would appreciate just prayers of protection and peace and strength and wisdom for all of our staff and board and everyone involved in planning the march in January and a few weeks after.
Well, we will do that. In fact, just to let you know, we just had on our program Bishop Pohjola out from Finland, and he will be actually going. They're back in Finland now. They are charging him with ethnic agitation for teaching the fundamental truths of the Bible. Become hate speech in Finland, if you can imagine that. And so our prayer for him was that if he's in the lion's den, the lion's mouths will be shut. And if he's in the fiery furnace, that the flames will not touch him. And that's going to be our prayer for you too.
Oh, thank you so much. That would be just really much, much appreciated.
All right, Jeanne. Well, God bless you and much success to this year's 2022 March for Life. And may this be the year when our culture turns towards life for all. God bless you.
Oh, please, God. Thank you so much. God bless.
Thanks for tuning in today. To get to know our LCRL DC work better, check out our website at lcrlfreedom.org. Contained there are resources to empower your public square dynamic discipleship. Or check out our weekly Word from the Center opinion piece every Friday at facebook.com/LCRL Freedom. Till next time, God bless you always. I'm Gregory Seltz. Have a great week.
You've been listening to Liberty Alert with Dr. Gregory Seltz, Executive Director of the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty in Washington, D.C. This program has been brought to you by the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty.